I'm Rika Burnham, Head of Education. It gives me great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to you who are here at the Frick and to our online audience on the occasion of the 4th annual Samuel H. Kress Lecture in Museum Education at the Frick Collection. 4 years is a kind of longevity in museum education that this lecture series is one of many museum education initiatives supported by the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. The Foundation's commitment to museum education is slowly but surely inspiring, challenging, and changing the work we do as educators in our museums. Our previous lecturers in this series, Philip Jackson, student and scholar of John Dewey, Kate Levin, Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, and Lee Patterson, professor at Yale University, all brought dynamic perspectives from outside our profession. This year, we turn to one of our own, fellow museum educator and museum colleague, Wendy Woon. She is not only museum educator, but artist, teacher, mentor, big thinker, and visionary extraordinaire. And, oh yes, by the way, Wendy also happens to be the Edward John Noble Deputy Director for Education at the Museum of Modern Art, a position she has held with distinction, tireless energy, a sense of humor, and admirable level-headedness. She has challenged her museum from within and without, and affected thinking about museum education far beyond the walls of her institution on 53rd Street. Or as some say, Wendy is just way cool. She's been rocking the big white box down the street for 5 fabulous years. I'd like to thank the New York City Museum Education Roundtable for co-sponsoring this event, and especially Max Marmer and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, who, again, their generosity in the field of museum education is rivaled only by the passion of the museum educators who have come here today to continue to examine our practice and forge new paths into the future. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague and my friend, Wendy Woon, and to ask her to gently shake this little historic box this afternoon. Could you please join me in welcoming Wendy Woon?
Thank you, Rika. I'm very honored to be asked to speak today. When Rika originally asked me, my first thought was, really? I wouldn't want to listen to me for more than 10 minutes. Why would anybody else want to? I'm really much more comfortable thinking out my ideas with colleagues over a bowl of tomato soup at Le Pain Quotidien. Once I agreed, though, I started to give Rika nightmares. I threatened that I would give the talk in a persona of someone else. First, it was Louise Nevelson, but then Sister Wendy. You know, Sister Wendy brought art to many people in the 90s who would not have had access prior to art through the magic of broadcast technology. I even learned through my antics that the good sister had been inspirational to one of the Kress Foundation members. I think there were even rays of light that were involved. So, who else could I be? Well, I went to MoMA, and there we go. Cindy Sherman was my inspiration. There's nothing better than a caftan to hide a myriad of sins. So I thought maybe if I could channel Rosamond Bernier, that would just make it okay. But being the first museum educator practitioner to give this talk is both an honor and a responsibility, and I'd like to thank Rika and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation for the honor. But I underscore that the talk today is a work in progress. This November, it will be 30 years since I began working in the field of museum education. I was trained as an artist, and I took my first full-time job at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, mostly because I needed a good dental plan. And now you know the second thing I have in common with Sister Wendy. But I ended up staying in the field because I believed that art has a critical role to play in the lives of many people on a daily basis. And I found opportunities to continue being creative in ways that had broader impact than in my own studio. So the original title of this talk was Looking Back, Thinking Forward. And it seemed like for the past few years, this has been my normal state. Looking back to the foundational history of modern museums in the first half of the 20th century to better understand how the educational mission of MoMA in particular and how it was interpreted and fulfilled. And at the same time, I've been looking forward to the rapidly evolving digital landscape with education at the crest of the tsunami and museums trying to ride the wave of change, not to be left in the wake, which to me is both exhilarating and equally challenging, though I fear it's left me not living in the present. This bidirectional exploration has fueled my optimism about the field of museum education and the expanded role of museums in a rapidly changing world. I'm going to speak about some of my mining of the past to think about the future for the next 35 to 40 minutes. And then I've asked two of the smartest people I know to be respondents, Michelle Elligot, the museum's archivist, the past, and Seb Chan, Director of Digital and Emerging Media at the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, the future. So they will give a response and we'll have a conversation at the end, which is what I'd feel much more comfortable with. So let me see. Oh, there we go. So why is the history of museum education and the important and central role that museum education played in the founding years of modern museums so relevant to the future? When I was preparing a class for museum education at NYU, I remembered this quote that was from 1978, that each generation seems to start over again, repeating rather than building on the mistakes and successes of the past. And I was reminded of the importance of knowing and sharing that history with the next generation of museum leaders when I was preparing to teach a course. And I believe that it's really critical for the field of museum education to document and understand the ways that the educational mission has been interpreted in response to the larger social and historical contexts and individual leadership over time, in order to be strategic about the future. My personal quest over the past few years has been to uncover the early history of MoMA's educational initiatives under Victor D'Amico, and to better understand the context for his work and the influences. Secondly, as museums struggle to adapt to a world of rapid changing public behaviors in communication, information, and learning, the tsunami that is upon us, reflecting upon that early founding mission of modern museums will inform how we carry out the mission in this amplified, dynamic social space and take it to a whole new level. A recent report, Libraries and Archives in the Era of Participatory Culture, noted that it is a critical moment for libraries and museums worldwide, and changing audience expectations and behaviors are required of libraries and museums to revisit and rethink their roles and mandates. Now, museums have another new wing, a virtual wing, and with a whole different set of parameters. No floors or walls, no original works of art, no insurance or art handling, but a space with the opportunity to engage an exponentially large number of people of all ages and all abilities from around the globe. Without physical constraints of a site, what should a museum be in its virtual space? A space that is increasingly social. How can its mission be fulfilled in new and different ways, appropriate to that context? For me, revisiting the early years of the development of the Museum of Modern Art and the progressive values that shaped it, linking art and democracy, social and civic engagement, has served as a framework for thinking more expansively about not only the possibilities for exponentially increasing the power of our public mission, and in tandem, the important leadership role that museum educators have to play. People are our medium. The skills and experience of museum educators whose deep knowledge of how to design social engagement that fosters learning, leading to deeper dialogue through art, can play a critical role in reaching and sustaining new audiences online. The evolving range of tools and platforms make the seemingly ephemeral experiences of teaching and learning visible and sustainable by fostering communities of interest-driven learners who learn not just from museums, but also from each other. So today I want to take you on a quick personal journey of my quest to think about the history of education within the Museum of Modern Art within a larger context. So I'm going to start with the progressive era. First, I wanted to know more about the progressive movement and how it had shaped the founding values of MoMA and many other museums. But I'd never really been able to get a firm grip on what exactly the progressive era was, which is roughly 1890s through 1920s, but really shaped the values of the 20th century. I began to consult a range of books and realized that my lack of clarity was warranted. Complexity, contradictions, multiple interpretations characterized the progressive agenda. This umbrella term, progressive, encompassed a wide range of people: radicals and conservatives, anti-labor and business interests, labor organizers, anarchists, but all advocating for progressive values of civic responsibility and cultural enlightenment while being at odds. The more I searched, the more I noted just some similarities to today. In a world of transformative technologies, there was great social unrest, anti-immigration sentiments, disparity between the wealthy and the poor, and also deep concern over the failing schools. All similar things. Class played an important role in that outlook, no matter what the position, and the changes of the progressive era were intended to reform and not revolutionize, preserving hierarchies in the status quo. The goal of addressing social issues, injustices, and inequities was to create harmony in society. As industrialization increased, there grew a larger gap between art and everyday life from the mid-19th century through the 20th century, the early 20th century. There arose a national quest to link art and democracy and located in everyday life, with the 30s being the decade wherein this link was realized on a broad historic scale. The progressive era also led to a wide range of reform in thinking about women and active participation by women in change. Through the suffragette movement, women sought voting reform and the power to cast votes. Civic institutions of social and cultural welfare, including settlement houses, libraries, and museums, also grew at a rapid rate, and many women played important roles in their development. Jane Addams is probably one of the most influential reformers, a Nobel Prize-winning social worker, feminist, and internationalist who founded Hull House in 1889 as a social experiment in an underprivileged area of Chicago. With its wide range of functions, including a kindergarten, after-school clubs for older children, an evening night school for adults, an art gallery, public kitchen, coffee house, gymnasium, school, swimming pool, bookbindery, art studio, music school, circulating library, employment bureau, drama group, and labor museum, Hull House embodied an alternative view of education and the progressive. A multi-generational community hub where the arts were integrated into daily life was the goal to improve the conditions in industrial districts of Chicago. The welfare and education of children became an important focal point of the progressive era, as shifting views of children were informed by a more scientific approach to understanding human development. John Dewey. All roads lead to John Dewey, I think. It was also in Chicago that John Dewey, the 20th century's most influential educational philosopher, forged his thinking about education reform with his innovative lab school. And as an experiment, Jane Addams' Hull House offered alternative models of education and aesthetic activity that influenced Dewey on Dewey's own thinking about education, experience, art, and democracy, that also fostered experimentation with new approaches to art and education in some early museums. Dewey spread his progressive theories about democracy and education and art and aesthetics through his published works and lectures. He had a profound impact on the museum field, influencing generations of founders, directors, and museum educators. In the 1930s, Dewey explicitly linked art and education to democratic theory in his lectures and influential book, Art and Experience, which, if you Google this, it comes up in Walmart. How is that democratic? He considered the art object important not as a material work of art, but as a vehicle for experience. Philosophically, this was a significant departure from the idea that the value of art objects was in their sacredness and timelessness. His thinking challenged traditional notions about the purpose of museums as places of collecting, exhibiting, and preserving the past. Dewey's ideas about art broke down the barriers between high and low forms of art. He considered art as a tool for effecting social change and called for an approach to art that integrated art into everyday life. Art needed to be useful and relevant to the experience of many, not just the upper class. Dewey challenged traditional definitions of art by focusing on process of making rather than on product. He considered art and creativity to be essential to a democratic society and natural to a fully developed mind. His aesthetic pragmatism was key to the way in which MoMA carried out its educational mission, both directly and indirectly, through the well-known work of its first director, Alfred H. Barr, Jr., and the work of MoMA's first director of education, Victor D'Amico. Our past. The founders of the Museum of Modern Art were three women. I can just imagine them, Abby Rockefeller, Lily Bliss, and Mary Sullivan Quinn, getting together. We've got the vote. What are we going to do next? Well, these women, who embodied a deep commitment not only to modern art, but also to democratic progressive agenda for art education. Mary Sullivan Quinn was an amateur artist and art teacher. Mary and Abby met when they were both interested in psychotherapy for returning World War I soldiers. Lily Bliss was an advocate for modern art when it had few admirers, a patron when it had almost no market, and a valiant champion of young artists. This was MoMA's biggest challenge, was how to make modern art accessible and engaging to a broader audience. The museum was founded, this is really exciting to look at, with a Regent's Charter for establishing and maintaining in the city of New York a museum of modern art, encouraging and developing the study of modern art and the application of such arts to the manufacture of practical life and furnishing popular instruction. This is how Alfred Barr saw the museum and his challenge. First, to be a place dedicated to helping people understand and enjoy the visual arts of our time, and that it might provide New York with the greatest museum of modern art in the world. Alfred H. Barr, Jr. was hired as the first director of MoMA in 1929. Barr was an art historian, and he'd put together the first modern art class at Wellesley in 1926 called Tradition and Revolt in Modern Painting, with the innovative pedagogical strategy of referring to all 9 students in the class as the faculty, making them each responsible for mastering and teaching some of the course content. That sounds like a plan, which included design, architecture, film, and sculpture, and underscored his belief that a broad understanding of culture was critical to an understanding of art. In the early years, Barr himself trained teachers and started a staff docent service for teachers and the public. He was very involved. Dewey's influence on Barr can be found in his statement. Words about art may help to explain techniques, remove prejudices, clarify relationships, suggest sequences, and attack habitual resentment through the back door of intelligence. But the front door to understanding is through the experience of the work of art itself. Barr intended to make experience a central part of MoMA's pedagogical program. In a 1932 bulletin, The Public as Artists, he stated, "Art is the joint creation of the artist and public. Without an appreciative audience, the work of art is stillborn. And the public shares equally with the artist the exciting responsibility of carrying on the great tradition of living art." Although the museum exhibited paintings and sculptures, there were key initiatives that spoke directly of Barr's interest in art and democracy, including exhibitions of design, art lending services, and publications, such as his What is Modern Art and Modern Painting series, where he was really trying to explain as much as possible and make art accessible, modern art accessible to people. But it's really through a series of exhibitions that you can really see how his pedagogical goals played out. This is Useful Objects Under $5 in 1938, and I found out that the year prior he'd done Useful Objects under $10, so things were going down at that point, obviously. So that idea of this exhibition was organized to help educate the public in how to recognize and consume good design, tethering economy and aesthetics together. Of course, during the Depression era, most did not have expendable income for art, so this really stressed the accessibility of being able to live with art. What is Good Design was another exhibition that circulated across the nation and supported the notion of an educated consumer. And although the aesthetic worth of the mass-produced industrial objects for all Americans fulfilled Barr's interpretation of art and democracy, it still required MoMA staff expertise to identify and assign standards of artistic value. Barr had been very influenced by the Bauhaus as well, so you do see some of his interest in industrial design, and he founded, he said the few days that he spent at the Bauhaus were some of the most important part of his education. But that was not the sole influence, and I think one of the key people who was a great influence on him was John Cotton Dana, the director. Oops, I'm sorry, I meant to mention these. These were just some amazing slides that I found of some of their early sort of aesthetic interest in educating on the horrible overstuffed easy chair, the traditional chair. And what I found very intriguing was what a great sense of humor MoMA had at that time about its mission to educate. So the idea of a gorilla and what you might lose in the chair as being part of their design. So John Cotton Dana, along with his educational advisor at the Newark Museum, had a big influence on Barr. His educational advisor was Louise Connolly, and she's actually one of the most interesting women that needs to be studied, as Carol Duncan, my good friend and a person who's written a wonderful book on John Cotton Dana, can attest. He pioneered modern ideas about art and experience in democracy through exhibitions that related directly to the lives of the population of Newark. For example, his clay products exhibition from 1915 drew from the experience of immigrant workers he sought to elevate both through the industrially and manually produced arts that reflected their experiences and their lives, of many of these people who worked in factories as well. And inexpensive objects, both exhibiting everyday materials such as ceramic tiles and objects that could be purchased at 5 and dime stores. He sought to underscore his belief in the common man's capacity for aesthetic experience. Barr was influenced by Dana's interest in aesthetics being integrated into day-to-day life and built upon his ideas, moving them towards creating these educated consumers and elevating taste for a wide range of people, and really kind of targeted at the middle class. But one of the lesser-known stories was with Holger Cahill. Now, I saw this photograph and I thought, isn't this the guy that you'd like to go out to the Cedar Bar with and have drinks? He looks so interesting, and he really was. Holger Cahill worked with Dana at the Newark Museum, but he was also aided Abby Aldrich Rockefeller in forming her collection of American folk art. But he also became the acting director of MoMA from September 1932 to May 1933. And during this time, he organized 2 key exhibitions, American Folk Art and American Sources of Modern Art. Both exhibitions established his broader sense of blurring the boundaries between Western and non-Western art and high and low. In 1935, Cahill headed up the Federal Arts Project of the Works Progress Administration, probably the most powerful agency for art in the history of the nation. Here he was able to put into play Dewey's ideas about art as experience and democratize art, taking it to a really systemic level that could not be achieved in the museums. Cahill set up about 400 community art centers through the Community Art Center program and launched a massive mainstream media campaign. The idea was to make artistic production more accessible to a mass public audience across the United States and to get people interested in art as an everyday part of life. Through the program, he not only commissioned artists to make works for the public buildings, but to teach as well. This constellation of communities of makers fulfilled Dewey's notion of a democratic form of art as experience. Cahill believed in the democratization of creativity rather than the cultivation of taste, stating that the pursuit of communal values in the arts can awaken a wish for a future organized around community as well as individual value. What Cahill had in common with Dewey and Barr was the belief that a democratic art would be experimental and grounded in widespread participation. Cahill's notion of experience and participation differed from Barr's, though, as he believed anyone could participate in making art. But for Barr, design could be accessed only through consumption. I also was thinking about Diego Rivera working on murals on view at MoMA. Our current exhibition kind of reminds us that the production of art and making of art was also part of those early days at MoMA. So now for what my real passion has been. I dig MoMA. Now I'm going to tell you a fun fact about Canadians. They've actually studied, Canadians have about 32 different varieties of self-deprecating humor, and one of them is showing your old art school projects in a PowerPoint. This is me from 1978 in a project about museums. Art imitating life, I don't know, life imitating art, where I created my own museum and did my own dig and that kind of thing. So what of MoMA's early educational initiatives? This was the driving interest for me when I started at MoMA. Urban legend had it that MoMA had a complicated relationship with museum education. My quest to understand that led me to the book Art in Our Time, authored by Michelle Elliott and Harriet B. What did not make sense from my perspective was that although MoMA was chartered as an educational institution, there were only 2 or 3 references to education in the book, and one was a mysterious memorandum reinstating the education department in 1978. It did not bode well. This was really at odds with many stories that people started to tell me as I started at the museum, telling me about life-changing experiences they'd had in classes at MoMA. They recounted them in loving and exquisite detail. So what ended up happening is over the last 4 years, and through the generosity of Teachers College, we tracked down where those archives were. And we now have those archives back at MoMA. They are being professionally processed, and they will be accessible to anyone to study in the future. So we're very excited about that. So we're sort of reclaiming some of that history. What also is interesting is at the very beginning with Barr, Nelson Rockefeller had asked Artemis Packard, who was he was a professor at Dartmouth and a very progressive professor, to really think from 1936 to about 1938, when the study was finished, about MoMA's educational mission and the future of the museum. And he really identified a need for a formal education department. He pondered in this study, should MoMA be maintained as a museum for the few or for the many? And he eventually identified that they should start an education project. But he also really articulated a number of the issues that are kind of the dueling issues that we face in many museums. The idea of the highest standards of critical discrimination and popular instruction. And he was very hopeful that at times they might seem antagonistic, but he was convinced that they would be found to complement and reinforce each other. And it seemed from what I have gathered that in those early days there was a real respect and a camaraderie, even in different directions. Barr had his educational initiatives, but also greatly supported D'Amico's as well. Barr clarified his thinking again in the early 40s about what he really thought the mission meant. And he said the primary purpose of the museum is to help people enjoy, understand, and use the visual arts of their time. That idea of utility, that art should have purpose and usefulness. When I was able to excavate about D'Amico's approach, at this point I can't go deeply, but there are certain themes and ideas that I see in them that I find inspirational. Was that the MoMA, it was greatly supported by MoMA's trustees and directors and provided a distinctly different interpretation of Dewey's artist experience than Barr's. He was really much more aligned to someone like Cahill's interest in art making as a means of creativity, the idea of creating centers or communities of production. as a means of experiencing art and a means of democratizing and focusing on the development of children and their creative potential. D'Amico's work did not take place within the galleries, and that's quite a departure from most museums. In fact, direct viewing of works of art in the galleries was an exception rather than a rule, and that the galleries' tours were given by some docents who were on staff. My colleague Juliet Kinchin, whose exhibition Century of the Child opens this summer, reminded me that design reform and pedagogical reform were intertwined. And although we tend to think about progressivism within the American context, social reform, and especially ideas about children and education, were central to the civic imagination across Europe. So there are a couple of themes when I looked at D'Amico's work that I found that I'm going to sort of give you a quick overview of things that I saw within art history. Was his idea about art as human necessity and the social value of art was something that he felt very strongly about. Design and pedagogy, design and how one supported that, your pedagogical goals through that was important. The idea of community and convening, and also technology, using technology to reach a more democratic, larger audience. So very briefly, D'Amico founded the education programs in 1937. It was called the Educational Project at that point, and it was really meant as an experiment. He started the Young People's Gallery with the goal of making the museum's collection of paintings and sculptures and architecture and industrial design and films more useful and more easily accessible to New York's public and private schools and the teaching of art in general. He talked about the space as being a quiet, simple atmosphere that would counteract the usual museum fatigue. He designed everything, so everything from the ledges that would go up and down to the walls to allow for paintings to be hung, or they could be pulled out so you could do a class mural project. The tables were all belted together and could be made into different configurations, and that's something, that attention to design of space and experience is something that you see a lot in his work. Just a closer example of that. The art carnivals that he created starting in 1942, you also see that same idea of design and pedagogy. Each was designed with specially built to scale, specifically for children 3 to 12 years of age. In each configuration, there was a way, kind of a passageway that would exclude adults from entering, or anybody that was bigger than, say, that child-size gate that he's created. He created, his notions were about motivation was the first part, so the sort of play and experience as being part of that with usually formal elements. But you'll also see the high sort of drama that's created with lighting and every sort of detail of chairs, and he designed every bit of it himself and worked with the people in the wood shop at the carpenter's shop at MoMA. So after you would spend time in the motivation area, then you would be able to, these are all motivation area, and there may be things to prompt or visuals to prompt you, works of art or objects to prompt your thinking. Then you would go in and create your own work, and it was very open-ended, and it was about your individual response and creativity with materials. And he was very particular about the kinds of materials and how they were set up as well. Every single step of design was important for him. I think this has to be Betty, Sally, and Bobby Draper. This is, it's just such a great image. This was one of the art carnivals that was actually held in the Buckminster Fuller Dome in the Sculpture Garden. Another important thing that he did was he created the War Veterans Art Center, and that was really, the social and civic role of art was very important at MoMA at that time, and this was part of a larger project. And the War Veterans Art Center began in 1945 44 as an experimental project, and it was open for free to men who'd served in the armed forces and merchant marines. And it provided them with pre-vocational kinds of experiences and creative experiences, but also taught skills as well. What's interesting is they really pioneered a lot of the early techniques of occupational and art therapy, and that's something that we'd like to know a lot more about. And it continues through our community and access programs, these kinds of relationships of the museum having a larger social role. That actually, the Veterans War Art Center closed in 1948, but it became the People's Art Center. And the People's Art Center is something people talk about a lot to me. There were a number of classes, it was something like 500 adults and 300 children came every week, starting from 3 years old up. And they were very experimental kinds of classes, and I'd like to know more about their pedagogy as well. But the idea that MoMA could have a People's Art Center in the 50s during the Cold War era, I find very interesting. So there's a mystery there to be told. Another idea that he had was the establishment of an art barge. He had been teaching classes in the 60s, early 60s, out in Southampton, and he had this idea to bring in a World War I Navy barge up onto a beautiful piece of land in Amagansett. And I keep thinking to myself, I can't quite imagine the call he made to Nelson Rockefeller to explain this. Apparently, he called Nelson Rockefeller and he said, what I'm really looking for is this World War I Navy barge. I have this idea. I want to create a studio space for people to do work in the summer. And Nelson said, like, sure, he made it. Sure, Mr. D'Amico, I'll get it done. So it's pretty amazing to think about that kind of support and the kind of creativity and openness that was at MoMA. So the Art Barge actually is a community. It continues on today as the Victor D'Amico Institute. I taught there last summer, and I have to tell you, as a designed space for learning, it's a genius space. It has 2 levels, and it's a place where everything is beautifully designed and almost like on a ship where everything folds in and comes out, and it's just amazing. With the People's Art Center, I did want to mention that he talked a little bit about the vital, the press release at MoMA talked about the vital function of a creative arts center. And to me, that was very much out of the Federal Arts Project and the Cahill kind of thinking about community. The other thing that he did was he founded a National Committee on Arts Education. And that was something that met every year from the 40s through the 50s. And the idea behind that, the idea of MoMA as a convener, because they really supported these conversations on art education. They would bring speakers, they would have exhibitions usually of children's work to talk about. But we found a reference to this in a press release that said, this committee is art education's answer to fascism and its contempt for creative art. So that idea that art had this larger social and important purpose in a time of war was really interesting to me. The other thing that D'Amico did was he used technology to try and reach a larger audience and foster creativity through a television series called Through the Enchanted Gate that was on WNBC. In the 50s. He had two runs of that series, and it was actually a part of a larger MoMA television project. And then a kind of global end to this, the art carnival often traveled to different places, Brussels as a kind of a demonstration of American progressive education. And it traveled to Brussels, Milan, Barcelona. But in 1962, it was presented to Indira Gandhi by Jackie Kennedy. And a number of teachers, including Arlette Buckman, who is here today, traveled all over India. The Art Carnival traveled all over India, and they taught teachers and children these kinds of methods of creativity. So D'Amico retired in 1969, and that is, he took with him a lot of the archives, which was very typical of that time. And so now it'll be wonderful to be able to have that information back and to really explore those roots of the museum. But today, I know of them has been very inspirational to many of us in our department. Material Lab is a hands-on place for experiential learning at the museum. We've experimented with adult programs, a print studio and Bauhaus Lab, different kinds of lab spaces where people can drop in. And we're finding that people are very receptive to that.
My interest in art has been ever since I was young. I was a military dependent, so we lived all over the world. Finally, a couple years ago, a couple friends said, stop looking, stop talking about it, and do something. And started checking out a lot of videos, of trying to learn, and felt like there was something there, but there was something a lot missing as well. And so in this opportunity, when I came across that MoMA was offering this course, then I thought that would be a perfect thing to try to do, and it's been the best thing. It's opened up a whole new world of things for me since then. One thing I found out was that a kid can't do everything. That even though it's abstract, it doesn't represent any particular objective thing. There's still structure, there's still color theory, there's still design, there's still a concept. And all of that comes into play and everything kind of works together. And whenever you use those ideas of what abstract is and then try to put it together, then it works and people have a tendency to understand it more. And as an artist, then I have an understanding much better of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And since the course is over, then like a group of 3 and 4 have met in Paris, they've met in Italy. They're planning a major get-together right outside of New York here next February. I hope to maybe attend that. And a course like this, even if you aren't wanting to be an artist, because you don't have to do the painting. The painting is an optional thing, but a person will get just as much out of it. So have a better understanding of what they're looking at and why it was done, how it was done. And so I think, sure, even if you're not an artist and you don't want to paint, then it's still a top-notch course to take.
The idea that we could start to foster communities who are interested in art and integrating art in their everyday life globally is something that very much interests me. What we've found from these small experiments is that we've got a couple of groups that have created their own Facebook pages. One student created a virtual exhibition in Second Life. And another one of our students actually took the class again to do it with her grandchild. But what it means is that we can sort of exponentially use the web to democratize and reach new audiences. Just to kind of give you an example of the reach that we're beginning to see. And it's kind of like occupying a new space for us. I wanted to end with this image of Google Art Project because I think that the web is going to allow us to realize many of Dewey's greatest hopes for a new way of learning. And the democratization of art can now be realized through the web if we embrace this virtual space and understand the unique opportunities of its dimensions and what it can do well to amplify the ability of us to achieve the museum's mission. It will continue to revolutionize our behaviors and expectations, and I think that we're in a good position to really respond to it. The 21st Century Museum can serve and educate to capacity inside the museum, but the web allows a 24/7 audience all around the globe. A community of learners just got supersized. And as we think about our expanded role as museum educators in the digital age, understanding this new environment, the opportunities to participate and connect through an ever-growing range of capabilities, to communicate, to create, to share, as vehicles for art as experience. Many of the progressive innovations about education, art, and democracy introduced in the 20th century can newly be realized because now it's no matter a matter of reform, it's a revolution. Thank you. So now I'd like to invite Michelle Elliott to respond, and then Seb, and we're going to have a conversation after Michelle talks. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the Kress Foundation and Wendy for this really excellent paper and for inviting me here today to provide just a few comments as response coming from my perspective as the museum archivist at MoMA. To begin, every museum has an identity that can be defined by its current activities and its purpose. This identity is formed by its past. If a museum is to have an identity, it must understand its history, and that history is dependent upon the records it has created. Without those records, the historian's sources consist only of secondary published accounts and the memories of individuals, which fade away over time. If an organization's records have not been preserved, one might say it has no history. And if there is no one responsible for preserving those records, as we all know, it's almost inevitable that one day they'll just be discarded to make space for new ones. So for a museum's past to be understood, we must ensure that records are systematically preserved, and the way that we do so is with archives. So what is an archive? Well, the word archives comes to us from the ancient Greek archeion, meaning that which belongs to an office. And perhaps more importantly, the verb archeo means I command, guide, or govern. And I think this is critical to underscore the power inherent in archives, which of course conversely implies the opposite when such documentation is lacking, whether by design or by accident or chance. So archives are, at a basic level, evidence and a witness to the past. So that is why we at MoMA Archives are so thrilled with the return to MoMA of the Victor D'Amico papers. Though before we had scattered evidence of some educational projects in our archives, without the Victor D'Amico papers, it was impossible to amass a thorough understanding of this pivotal program, one which I might add, as you well know, was for decades a touchstone and replicated by many other programs across the country. Now, Wendy has just provided an astute overview, but I also wanted to add a few additional comments about education as part of the very DNA of MoMA. She mentioned the three founding ladies and Mary Quinn Sullivan being an art teacher. I think Sullivan is very interesting. She studied art at Pratt, the Art Students League, and at the Slade School of Art in London. She then taught art in the New York City public schools. And in fact, the Board of Education of New York City was so impressed with her work that they sent her to Europe to observe art schools there. Sullivan was certainly the most knowledgeable of the founders about art education. And we can only surmise that it was her imprint that directed the museum's strong educational mission from its inception. But there's one other person I'd like to call out. In addition to the three founding ladies, Josephine Boardman Crane was an original member of MoMA's Board of Trustees. The widow of Murray Crane, former governor of Massachusetts and president of the Crane Paper Company, she held a legendary weekly literary and cultural salon here on Fifth Avenue at 63rd Street. But perhaps more importantly for our conversation today, she was the main benefactor of the Dalton School in New York and was deeply interested in education. So combining this wide-ranging interest in art and her deep commitment to experimental education, and further, she was the chair of the Education Committee at MoMA in the 1930s. We have to believe that she must have deeply influenced the educational mission of the institution. So I think we can say the founding of MoMA was a distinctly different proposition from many of the other museums established in the same era. MoMA's enlightened patrons, as Wendy pointed out, sought to establish a center to educate about modern art. They were not wealthy industrialists founding museums simply to showcase their own superlative private art collections. I apologize, Mr. Frick. MoMA, from its inception, distinguished its purpose as not just presenting works of art of the recent past, but rather saw itself as a laboratory where new ideas were explored and in the language of the time, the public was invited to participate. This idea of the museum being a laboratory allowed the staff to create a program which was exploratory. The museum acted as an incubator for new ideas, whether that be the exhibition program or the educational project. Just briefly, I also wanted to touch upon John Dewey. Wendy explained the way in which his theories played out at the museum. In addition to studying this lineage, indeed, we actually have documented intersections of Dewey and the museum. I'm very proud to say we have this beautiful leather-embossed VIP guest book that he signed on at least 2 occasions. And in 1934, he, along with Amelia Earhart and Charles Richards of the Museum of Science and Industry, actually acted as judges to select the most beautiful objects in the machine art exhibition, which Wendy mentioned. You might be interested to know that Dewey chose the propeller. We have a great photo of the 3 judges holding their chosen objects very proudly. And finally, moving on to technology, the embrace of new technologies is not new for MoMA. As early as the 1930s, the museum collaborated on a series of radio broadcasts titled Art in America. And in 1939, the museum held the first television broadcast ever by an American museum. As Wendy mentioned, the museum continued to experiment with TV, both as a vehicle for educating about modern art, as well as exploring television as potentially the new artistic medium. This later led to video and what we today call new media. Technology and the web continue to challenge museums to explore their potential, whether as a vehicle of communication or a point of creation. Wendy's notion that the digital world will reprioritize values is spot on. And what I find so interesting about this is the impact on archives. We are living in a world that has succumbed to archives fever, if you will. And I personally believe this is a direct result of the internet, for it is only with the web that unique primary source documentation has become democratic and accessible to a vast audience. What was once the domain of the elite esoteric scholar is now available to any man, woman, or child through just a few simple clicks of the mouse. Now, some feared that the internet would diminish the effect of the authenticity and aura of the original that comes with direct contact. Instead, I believe it has served the inverse and has enhanced and heightened the interest in, hunger for, and understanding of archives and unique primary source materials. Of course, over the past decade, the way in which we work has been dramatically transformed. For many of us, the majority of our professional production takes the form of electronic records, whether that be email, databases, web programming. We embrace this technology because, of course, it enhances creativity and productivity. However, the byproduct is that electronic records can be much more difficult to maintain than old-fashioned paper records. So at the same time, we've actually increased our risk of losing the records we want and need to keep. We are facing a moment of crisis for the archives of the future. We must be mindful of the challenges of selecting and preserving a great mass of data and be diligent in our approach to combat issues like technical obsolescence and bit rot by proactively undertaking data normalization and migration and enacting long-term preservation strategies. We must not turn a blind eye to this issue, for if we do, we risk the loss of the archives of the late 20th and early 21st century. So it is in these ways that we at MoMA Archives know our past, work in the present, and do our very best to try to anticipate the future.
Yes, we're going to do this. Okay. So, Michelle, that was great. You raised a lot of issues about authenticity, and I think that's something that as museums we think about our collections and what's going to happen with them online. Seb, I heard you talk at the NAEA about collections as databases.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that really in the digital space, museums need to have the same kind of mission that we saw you talking about in terms of MoMA in the early days. They had a very clear identity and mission that had a purpose. And digital experiences within museums for the last 15 to 20 years have been searching for their own unique purpose, that unique thing that is possible in the digital space that isn't possible anywhere else. We're beginning to, I think, and I hope, realise that that is not replicating the experience of physical galleries, but is about connecting works of art and the connecting tissue between works of art. Mm-hmm. And this is where I've started to see in my own work at the Cooper Hewitt and previously at the Powerhouse in terms of making collection metadata publicly and freely available, because that collection metadata, the descriptive texts about works, even the images of works, has both less and more value within the digital space. Less in the kind of sense is in that it isn't the actual work, but more in kind of that it gains value, as you've seen in the Google Art, the Google Art project, when you can actually see a full spectrum of a period, a place, or an artist on a screen, which you could never do within a physical gallery. And I think that's what is becoming very exciting. Now we need museums to assert a purpose behind their digital projects so that we can actually realise those connective benefits.
I think that word connectivity is really an important one. I was thinking, that so much of what we do, it takes an isolated art object and it puts it in a context that can, tie back to everyday life through primary source documents and that kind of thing. So in many ways, it really provides an ideal learning sort of environment that is much expanded and can be complementary to a museum.
Yeah, I mean, there are obvious challenges, I think, as museums began using the web, particularly as an extension of their marketing activities, for want of a better word. And I think that's where we need to pull out of that a little bit and assert a parallel path where there is a sense that it is fabulous for marketing and reach, but it can also do these other things that have been yet poorly explored.
Absolutely. Michelle, any thoughts you want to share?
Well, I'm just very interested in this notion of connectivity and hyperlinking, and it's actually something that, a concept that we're trying to take into the archive world and think more about ways to make connections among documents and among various collections, because traditionally you've one looks at archives in this very sort of static, linear way. And I think moving forward, frankly, with technology, if we can expose the documents almost as they had circulated. Mm-hmm. They circulated back and forth between these two people, but now we just see the letters of Alfred Barr that he received. But it'd be nice to get back into the papers of the sender and see what else the sender was collecting at the same time. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity there.
And there's a lot of challenges for our systems too. I think our cataloguing systems, the archiving systems, haven't adjusted to capture that social life of collections and collection records. That is very hard to, we find it very hard within museums to archive an exhibit, because an exhibit has a layout, it has a structure, and those are currently done in a very, very rudimentary way. Yet there's now also this parallel social life of the visitor as well and the viewer that is completely unexplored.
Right, and I'm also interested how we're going to be capturing that data for the long term as well.
That's something that I think about a lot. You're talking about connectivity of things and objects, but the connectivity of people online too. And one of the things that I find most fascinating is when we look at these online courses and you can see threaded discussions and you can see people's responses and you can see sort of peer-to-peer learning taking place. And what I find really exciting as a museum educator is what we do is often so ephemeral. No one really sees how, we talk about it, we know how great it is, we know how transformative it is, but this makes it visible. So, someone like Doug can, send us a video. Last week, Colleen Brogan had a number of people send videos to us, and it was really amazing to hear these powerful stories of why art meant something to them, and that experience of making something or learning about something, what a powerful effect it had in their lives, and people from all over the world. And I love the idea of, the ability for somebody from Istanbul and the Bronx and Vancouver to all be having conversations together and learning from each other's experience, the experience that they bring to looking at a work of art or thinking about art. That to me is really dynamic and exciting and really great for our field.
Yeah, and I think when that's defined as the purpose, it becomes the thing that people look for to measure success, rather than in the digital space at the moment. People use the number of people, the quantitative things, which are very, very poor measures of
Right.
these great impactful experiences.
Right.
It's this qualitative stuff that really matters and counts.
And maybe it'll be really helpful for us in terms of being, as you say, giving us data to really look at experience and think about how we evaluate what we do in different ways. I think we'd love to open it up to some questions that you might have as well, or thoughts that you have. Anybody have a question? I'll be the runner.
So, Wendy, you mentioned how Artemis Packard had described the museum as having this dual goal of, on one hand, enhancing critical discourse on art, and on the other, enabling the popular instruction about art. And he did believe that these missions would come to support one another, but he also said that they were antagonistic to one another. And my question is, do you think we've overcome that antagonism? And if so, how did we do it?
I think, I often think the antagonism, it depends on what the values are and people's values are. I think it often comes down to very human interpretations of what one's role is and what one is doing. I think there was a huge focus on, at the end of, what I can gather from, at the end of Demika's period, there's a lot of thinking about the valuing of scholarship and kind of more an academic enterprise for the museum became its focal point. I think now, I mean, the web is changing everything. I mean, we can't write in the same way. People's behavior is changing. People want information in different kinds of ways. I think that it continues in some cases when people hold on to the values of, not that scholarship is bad, but it's appropriate to an academic setting. A museum is a public space, and I feel very strongly that, certainly quality is always something that you want, but quality and accessibility can live together, and that should be your goal always. I think things are changing though, and I think it's really on a case-to-case basis. I think there was a question.
Hi, first thank you all for your comments, and Wendy, that was a great talk. I have two questions. One is specifically for Michelle. I wanted to ask you just about, as museums start engaging people online and engaging their visitors and their audiences through interactions that take place off-site, how are you thinking about that as an archivist? What are some of the ways that you're thinking about archiving that part of our history? Because that's going to be a major part of our educational history moving forward. And then the second question that I had was really for maybe Seb and Wendy. And Seb, you mentioned this a little bit about things that we can do online that we can't do on site. And so I was wondering if you two had any thoughts about that, or any examples of things that are happening now that you think are particularly unique to an online space that's been a success in terms of museums doing something different online that complements or adds to their on-site experience.
Okay, well, that's, yes, it's a grave concern. I think basically we're just not there yet. in the sense that I've been spending the last year and a half doing a study of how museums are dealing with their electronic content and archiving electronic content. And frankly, I think we need to focus on some sort of basic system-wide issues first. For example, there is no email archive at MoMA, if you think about it. So the fact that all the correspondence between artists and curators is happening over email, what are we going to do? So I think we have we're a few steps behind, but that would certainly be part of the larger agenda. I'd say point 3 on that agenda is MoMA.org in general, and so given that these things are existing within MoMA.org, I would hope that we could somehow envelop that in the discussion, how do we archive MoMA.org? But at this time, it is not really being archived. The Internet Archive has taken, 2,118 snapshots of it, but it's truly a shame that a website that, over time has been lauded for some, design, innovation, et cetera, and content and accessibility hasn't been properly archived. So it's at Budget Committee.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about one example, which is a museum in Hobart, Tasmania, that's taken the assumption that visitors can get everything they need from the web. So they've taken away labels altogether from objects. And they've delivered an experience that is all about looking at the works and providing a mobile experience that has designed in features that force people to look at the works without looking at the screen. That I think has been quite a valuable challenge to museums to think about what happens when everybody carries around in their pockets more access to more information than ever before. How does that both enhance a visit on one hand, but also detract from everyone else's visit because all the visitors are looking at screens instead of looking at the walls. So these are both challenges, and it's very good to see nimble, medium-sized to small museums testing the waters around what does it mean when mobile is in your gallery, rather than just providing an audio tour or an enhanced multimedia thing, which frankly you can get anywhere else. That's on one hand. The other one is this shift for museums to become event spaces and being heavily driven by events. And I also have two. I think it's a very positive thing in that museums are becoming very lively social spaces in their physical presences, but also that I do have a fear that we're not addressing the issues around what happens to collections and what happens to contemporary collecting and what happens to the opportunities now for not only visitors to feedback on existing collection works, but to help museums make better acquisitions through collective opinion. What is the role of curators as selectors versus, say, curators as the voice of intelligent opinion about important works to hold? And also, what does it mean now to hold a work in a collection? Why should a work sit in a single collection anymore? What does preservation for hundreds of years, 50 years, 10 years mean? Should we have semi-permanent collections which are held initially for five years and then re-evaluated based on visitor feedback? Now we can actually do that at scale, not at just the opinions of a few people in a focus group, but the opinions of thousands of people walking through our galleries. I think these are big issues for museums to face, and they're ones that the digital tools are incredibly well kind of suited for. But these are the issues I think museums are avoiding in many ways. They're rolling out more audio tours and beautiful websites and things that really are Wikipedia with fancy design. Whereas we have Wikipedia, we don't need another one. We need to do something that enhances Wikipedia by not actually being it and contributing to it. So we're still trying to figure out what this is.
think I'm very interested in what I see socially, and not necessarily in museums. I'm kind of looking a lot at games, and I'm interested in sort of the collective intelligence that they can bring together. I have an 11-year-old, so I get to see games on a regular basis every day. And I've been very interested in looking at Little Big Planet, which is a game where you can play with, he's playing with kids all over the nation, probably the world, at the same time in our living room, and creating their own layers and challenges for each other. So they actually create the next level, and then they share levels. And I'm always sort of interested in how kids can come together or not kids, but anyone can come together to solve problems together, to challenge each other to new things, to share different ways of doing things, as problem solving. I think that to me is something that we need to be able to embrace and see how that, infiltrate that into what we do. But the amazing creativity, one day my son he had this, it looked like something Leonardo had invented, this kind of beast-like, insect-like floating thing. And he, jumped on, and he invited somebody else to jump on, and they were going for a ride through the sky. And I said, "Wow, did you make that?" And he said, "Oh, no, somebody made it and gave it to me." And to me, that's really amazing, that sense of not that this is mine and I'm against you, but that I could make something and gift it to you, and that now you could give it to somebody else and they could have an experience with it too. To me, that kind of generosity and collective intelligence is exciting. Any other questions? Let's see. There's one over. I'm going to go here, and then I will.
Thinking about this idea of collective intelligence and sharing knowledge and everything, and something that Seb said about museums opening up their archives to everyone, making all the information about all the artworks public. I'm curious, as Wendy, as you sit in the middle of that, and Michelle, as you sit in the protective archive spot of that idea, how do you feel about that? I feel like museums sit, there's this idea that, the archive is this sacred thing, that some of it can be available, but, you make an appointment and you have to be a scholar to go see all of that information, versus making it accessible for educational purposes for anyone and everyone to make those connections. How do you feel about sitting in those positions?
Well, I'm not sure we'd be in different positions if there was a little more, money in the world. I mean, we'd love to, anything that we have processed and available for research, we'd love to, frankly, digitize it all and, index it well and hyperlink it and just have it out there. So we believe in open access, and anything that's open, we would love to promote it even more. Again, it's just an issue that we're just not there yet.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I don't think it's about. I think it's about being clear as to why kind of you want to do it. This is about aligning a mission around that sort of purpose. It's no point, if you don't have a reason for making things accessible. You make accessibility part of the mission, and that's not certainly for everybody, and that's okay.
Thank you, everybody. I want to piggyback on what Wendy was saying about the Little Big Planet. I was lucky to pioneer game design at a school called Kress Lecture, where we use Little Big Planet, where students build their versions of these tables using levels of Little Big Planet. And to me, the art form of the 21st century is game design, and video games is where most of our kids are spending their time. If you go back 100 years ago, film was the unique art form. We had 100 years of that. It's something that I think all museums should be thinking about fully and looking at. And so I was interested in more of what you have to say.
Well, actually, we're hosting a 2-day symposium on game design in May May 17th and 18th, and a group of staff members, we actually partner with Quest to Learn, as a matter of fact, and we just went through a 3-day workshop, series of workshops, 3 departments, communications, education, and digital media, learning about games, learning how to modify games, and how to do game processes as part of our learning, and helping us to think about that. So that we did that with the Institute of Play as well. So it's something that's very much on our minds as a cultural thing, that we need to play better together and learn how to play. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.